ha scritto due libri importanti, uno uscito 20 anni fa sulla paura e il secondo che è un aggiornamento, una continuazione del primo, che si chiama How Fear Works, cioè quali sono gli effetti sociali della paura, che è uscito poche settimane fa. Oggi ci parlerà dell'impatto dell'intelligenza artificiale sulle relazioni sociali e sul futuro del lavoro, e io non voglio trattenerlo ulteriormente, quindi gli do la parola. Frank?
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm going to talk about technology and work, but I think it's important to realize that we tend to fetishize technology and see it as somehow separate from our humanity. And when we talk about the wonders of technology, we forget that what we are really talking about are the wonders of the human creative mind. Because behind technology, behind that robot, behind that computer, behind that machine, are millions and millions of hours of work put in by human beings to get to the point where that technology is invented. And behind all that technology that you see, all that hardware, is the imagination and the creativity of people who've been thinking about how to make their life better for a very, very long time. So it's very, very important to understand that technology, although it seems to be very far and distant from our humanity, is actually an extension of who we are. You know, just as our arms are a very useful tool, we use our hands and our arms to create, to manipulate, to change the world, so simple tools and machines are an extension of that arm. And as we develop further and further, live in a more complex world, so too computers and robots and drones, they too are an extension of our creative powers. And it's important to realize this because the way we perceive technology is very often as somehow a phenomenon that's just been created out of nowhere, for which we bear very little responsibility, and for which we, in a sense, feel very much estranged about. I think the really important thing about technology and the potential of technology is it has the capacity to increase the amount of free time or surplus time that's available to us. If you look at the process of human development, you know, we began to live in a world where people had to work most of the time just to survive. There was very little free time to enjoy, to play, to mess around, to create. And I think with the passing of time, what has happened is that through the ability of human beings to create machines and technologies, we've been able to expand the amount of time where we don't have to work to reproduce ourselves and to survive. And through the expansion of labor productivity, what we've managed to do is create a world where we have more choices about how we live our lives. I think that's the irony in many respects, is that the more we worked in the past, the harder we worked, the more we've created, the more we've been able to create a situation where with the expansion of free time, we've been able to develop a situation where we have more control of our lives. Because you have to remember that if you work all the time, you're not able to control your destiny, you're not able to control your life, because all the time you're forced by necessity to work and work and work. So we've been able to control more of our lives, and also we've been able to have more choices about what kind of human beings we want to be, how we want to create. And that's an important element that we have to remember. My feeling is that despite all the technological developments that have occurred, and despite the tremendous increases in the amount of freedom we have as a result of free time, we're still a little bit fairly far away from a situation where we genuinely have real choices and when we genuinely are in control of our circumstances and of our destiny. Now, when we look at technology, I think the important question we have to ask about technologies like artificial intelligence or any other technology, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how do we use it? Because technology always raises one essential existential question, which is that of judgment. We make judgments about how technology can be used or should be used. So if you take, for example, the way that artificial intelligence is used, AI technology is used, you'll find that it's got some incredibly creative uses. In medicine, if you have, in a sense, AI being used to diagnose and to screen patients, they can do it more efficiently than a tired doctor does. Most doctors that I know are always complaining about how tired they are, how much they work, and very often they miss out some very important sort of features that come up in an X-ray or an other diagnostic mechanism. And while a robot or a form of artificial intelligence can screen and pick up problems in a very efficient way, the doctor can stand back and use his clinical judgment to make decisions about what is the consequence of that finding, how to respond to that, what kind of treatment they should be using in relation to that. So I think in that sense you can see artificial intelligence, if it's used in the right kind of a way, if it's used to enhance our sense of judgment or creativity, it's a very positive development. But even in simple areas of our life, for example, if you take manual work, and we still do a lot of manual work, maybe not at this university, but outside, it's still a common phenomenon among people. If you look at manual work, we have, at the moment, forms of technology which allows manual workers to put on this robotic skin on themselves, which enhances their physical powers, whereby through the use of this technology, essentially manual workers turn into strong robots who can lift far more, are able to deal with far more strenuous physical challenges than they could do otherwise. We have drone technology, which can be used very, very effectively to look at the tops of buildings, to look at bridges, to see whether repairs need to be done on roads, all those things that take hours and hours and hours of hard physical labor. These things can now be done by the use of AI. And of course, even in farming, I'm really impressed by the way that AI-driven tractors have been used in the countryside, where, for example, they're much better than human beings at knowing whether or not to use pesticides, which are not very good for the environment, and they can make a distinction between plants and weeds. So all these things can be used very, very creatively if we make the right kinds of judgments. I think that one of the interesting things that has occurred in relation to this use of technology is that we talk a lot about it. I've been to loads and loads of conferences where we talk about the future of artificial intelligence, what's going to happen with the robots, and all the rest of that. We talk a lot about it, but actually, we seem to be living in a world which is all talk and no action. If you look at the rate at which new technology is being introduced into industry, you'll find that it's far slower than you would suspect. I think it's worth noting that most of the new technology that is being innovated often gets used in very narrow sectors. The ICT sector is one that uses it quite a bit. It gets used a lot in gaming and in the consumer sector in terms of luxury production, but not for the use of productive ends. For example, it's well worth noting that most people that I know have not had their jobs and their work life altered by the introduction of new technology. AI has not been used extensively in most sectors, public sector and private sector, in recent times. So there's been a very, very risk-averse, slow process of introducing these kinds of technologies. It was, I think, back in 1960 that the American car company GM used the first ever robot. That was a very, very long time ago. Since 1960, the introduction of robot technology in car industries and elsewhere has been fairly minimal. And it's well worth noting that the only place where there does seem to be a genuine commitment to apply technology to the world of work in a consistent way is not in Europe, it's not in America, but in the Far East. You'll find that it's in Japan, it's in China, it's in Singapore and places like that, that people are introducing robots. And I think they're doing it very cleverly. For example, in places like China and Japan, they've got an aging population. People are getting older and older. They're having less and less young people relative to the aging population. They're now using robots as a way of helping to look after old people. I don't know if I want to be looked after by a robot. I kind of hope that I will have a friend or two to occasionally help me out. But nevertheless, they are using robot technology to assist the aged, to provide a variety of services for them. And from what I can tell, talking to some colleagues from Japan, it does seem to have a certain kinds of positive effect. So in the Far East, we do have a slightly different sort of situation in relation to this. Now, and when you kind of step back, the question that you really need to ask is why is it that we're so slow to introduce new technology and to use AI? I think the reason for that, and the reason why it's all talk and no action in Europe, is because of what economists call the productivity puzzle. If you look at the world we live in, the capitalist system at the moment seems very, very reluctant to make investments in infrastructure and in industry and in technology. I think most capitalists at the moment would rather put their money into the financial sector and speculate than to invest in AI technology in a variety of different settings where it could be used fairly effectively. If you look at the consequence of that, it means that in Europe, productivity, which is very, very important, it's the amount of resources a society produces per hour. Productivity has been flat. In Italy, it's been flat for 25 years. Right? I mean, that's really amazing when you think about it. But it hasn't simply been an Italian problem, because throughout Europe, there's been a very similar pattern where the rate of growth of productivity in the last 2 generations has been far, far lower than in any other time since the end of the Second World War. And consequently, when you look at the productivity puzzle, when you look at the way in which people are not investing in machinery and in technology, you can really understand why it is that technology and AI and all the discussions about robots and DVD printing, all these things are really much more for show rather than for reality at the moment, although it doesn't really have to be that way. And also, I think when we then take a step back from the productivity puzzle and ask a few questions, we do find that when technology is introduced, it's often done with very, very poor judgment. So for example, in Texas, we have a situation where there's now a big discussion about opening up the first brothel that is going to be employing only robots. I mean, I don't know what goes through people's minds, in terms of, I can't even begin to imagine what's going to be going on there. But what a waste of resources and what a waste of creativity to kind of think about putting technology into that sector rather than perhaps helping people in Texas produce food or other kind of resources far more effectively. We see the use of poor judgment in relation to AI in the way that Amazon has produced these bracelets, which they're about to use, they haven't used yet because of an uproar. And the aim of these bracelets is that their workers would wear them so that they could be continually surveyed and in that way made to work harder. In other words, what Amazon is trying to do is to turn their workers into robots by using AI technology, which is really not a creative way of developing the relationship between technology and human beings. So there are some very negative examples as well, which we should bear in mind. But all this stuff and all this discussion about that I've been relating to raises the question of what does it mean for work? Yeah. What does it mean for work? Are we going to work less? Are we going to work differently? What's the consequences of AI and all the different technologies? It seems to me that the positive potential of AI, as far as work is concerned, is that it can, if we make the right judgment calls, enhance the meaning of work. It could create more potential for creative use of our resources at work. In other words, by using technology, we could free up time at work to use in ways where we can use our creative powers, where we can experiment a little bit, take a few risks, try out new ways of doing things, and thereby, in a sense, develop at a much more rapid rate, but also develop a way of working which is, in a sense, much more meaningful than is the case at the moment. I think a lot of people are hoping, that perhaps it's going to create a world where we have to work less and we can work less. And I can really understand why a lot of people would like the idea, for example, of a 15-hour week or a 20-hour week. It's very attractive, especially if you have a job which is full of drudgery, where you have no control over the timing of your work, where you're, in a sense, continually being watched over by your boss. It's not always a very pleasant experience, and I think a lot of people would enjoy spending less time in those kinds of environments. But just think about it. I mean, what is work? Whether you like it or not, most of us, most human beings, develop their identity through their work. Right? We are who we are through what we do. Right? We're not just simply biological entities. We're not just simply being created by somebody else and we just exist and gain our identity through this natural process. We're social beings, we're human beings who, through transforming the world around us, also alter ourselves. And through the work that we do, we learn even in the most difficult circumstances, and through the work that we do, we get a sense of who we really are. Very often, work doesn't have that much meaning to us in this kind of situation that we kind of live in. And very often, the meaning that we look through our work doesn't really kind of come to us. One of the things that we've done in order to make work meaningful is to try to erode, in some circumstances, the line between work and play, or the line between work and non-work. And I think it's interesting that the place where this is happening first is in the technological sector. I don't know if any of you ever seen any pictures or seen any films of what it is like to work for Google. Right? I mean, I've been to Google in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I've talked to the people. And you go into Google, and when you go into a Google workspace, it does look like a playpen, right? I mean, everybody's in jeans, everybody's got a T-shirt on, everybody, is got, drinking something, and they're all walking. They're very chilled out. They're all walking like that, they've got so much spare time on their hands. They got bean bags on the floor. There is fresh fruit and bananas all over the place. You go next door, there are sandwiches, and people are munching on food while they're kind of working on their computers. It looks like a nirvana, it's just wonderful. And you kind of say, well, what the hell is going on here? Is this a kind of an entertainment environment, or are people actually working? Are they making any money? Are they doing anything productive? And of course, when you talk to the guys who work at Google, although they live in this kind of fantasy world of a playpen, this kind of very infantilized playpen, where they can still be children, nevertheless, they do have to work very, very hard. And some of the people I know who work at Google work 14, 15 hours a day. I know a friend of mine whose boyfriend works at Google in Dublin, and he doesn't come home. You know, they even give you a little pod where you can sleep, but he literally lives there and works, 16, 17 hours a day, and that's part of the job. So work is, the technology and work is not something that you can just kind of give up in that simple sense. So the question becomes, what do we do about it? And I think the challenge for us is to learn to humanize both technology and learn to humanize our work through the way we use technology. I think that's the key challenge to us. One of the things that we've been struggling towards for a very, very long time is to gain meaning through work, so the identities that we develop as human beings actually means something more to us. And I think that one of the interesting things for us to deal with and engage with is to get to a situation where we are no longer estranged by work. One of the things that we learned since the beginning of capitalism is that as we work, we often become very much estranged from our machines, from the products that our machines produce. We see them as somehow separate from us. Even though we've given a lot of our energies and our creative powers to it, we still see it as being something separate from us. I think that now, with the new kind of technologies that are developing, we have the possibility of overcoming that estrangement if we begin to see it not as something that is separate from us, but as something that expresses an important dimension of our humanity. You know, there are a lot of books being published at the moment that are warning us about the dangers of robots. I mean, if you go to a bookshop, you'll find that a lot of people are saying that robots are going to acquire an autonomy, a power of their own. They're not going to listen to us. They're not going to allow themselves to be mastered by us. I don't think we need to worry about this kind of dystopic vision of what these robots will do to us, for the very, very simple reason that we've created them. You know, we have the capacity to make judgments about how we're going to be using them. And as long as we bear that in mind, I think technology will serve us quite well. The challenge for us, just to conclude, it seems to me, the key challenge for us is to decide not whether technology is good or bad, not whether it's going to create for us less or more work. The key challenge for us is to enhance the meaning of work. Finally, we get into the point where we can enhance the meaning of work. And secondly, through enhancing the meaning of work, create a situation, create a world where the work we're doing through this new technology creates ends and a vision which takes our humanity a step further. Our humanity, who we really are, can be developed and altered through the judicious use of technology. And therefore, we should have a much more optimistic vision of technology that we have at the moment, whilst at the same time realize that fetishizing technology, thinking that they're the solution to the problems of humanity, is ultimately really, really flawed, because at the end of the day, everything in the future, everything in the place of work, depends on our capacity to make wise judgments. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. We have a few minutes. Abbiamo un po' di tempo per qualche domanda, ma prima di tutto ne volevo fare una io, ricollegandomi a quello che ha detto adesso il professor Furedi sul fatto che il lavoro è la fonte è la fonte principale della nostra identità personale. Frank, I was interested from your point that work and our identity are strictly connected. I was wondering what you think about these proposals to have a general basic income to solve the problem of wage stagnation and unemployment in the next future.
Well, I changed my mind a lot about the general basic income. I think that what we need is a safety net so that within society, everybody has got some mechanism whereby they can ward off the worst features of poverty. But my main worry, and I see this a lot in England, is that very often resources are provided for people in such a way that it gives them a disincentive to find work. And it seems to me that the key challenge for us is to have a situation where we expect people to work, not because we're kind of martinets that want to force people into work, but because unless people work, they will never manage to develop their creative powers. They will never develop their strengths. They will always have a certain kind of tendency towards passivity. And I think that I've seen situations, where I live in England, there are communities, where people have not worked for 4 generations. Imagine what happens when you haven't worked for 4 generations, where your personality has never had the opportunity to develop through creating something, through engaging with people. I think work is also important because it's one of the few areas in our society where we develop connections and solidarity and friendships. I think people often forget how important work is for developing our capacity to engage with one another. So I think that anything that minimizes the possibility of people working or acts as a disincentive for people to work, I would be against. And I think that the best thing for that would be to create a welfare system that provides a safety net to people, particularly for the elderly and people who are ill and people who have got some kind of illness or other kind of conditions. But at the same time, I think those more resources should be devoted towards providing jobs for people. I think that's what we should be dealing with. I think it's easier to give money to people than to find jobs for them. I think that's the real challenge in the future.
Okay. Grazie. Abbiamo ancora qualche minuto. Ci sono domande?
Thank you, and thank you, Frank Furedi, for such an enlightening speech. I've got 2 questions. One, I was really struck by your example of prostitute robots in Texas, and the whole idea of the necessity of harnessing a socially intelligent creativity onto AI. So have you got any idea of how that can be made, performed, that harnessing of the social, the intelligent, and the creative onto what we're doing with technology and artificial intelligence? And that's one thing. The other thing has got to do with work. It is true, obviously, that work is so much part of our identity. Work has been at the heart of many battles for empowerment and emancipation throughout history. If I think of the history of feminism, for example, that the first suffragettes asked for work. I mean, they said, give us work and the knowledge that we need to work for this society. So that's a given. I think it's part of what we think we are today. But there are people in the world that will never have a job. I was talking to a Shilinbembe last night, and Africa is an example of this. There are people who will never be able to find a job. Part of our youth in Italy have stopped looking for jobs. They don't study, they don't work, they don't do anything. So this is a world in which, on the one hand, there's more people than work. And I think we'll have to envisage a world in which a change of paradigm has to take place. We'll have to harness our own existence onto something else.
Well, I think you raise a very interesting question, because, as you say, there are a lot of people who don't work, not just in Africa, but in Europe. And at the same time as they don't work, there are also people in jobs that they like who work all the time, who never stop working. So you got this kind of paradox occurring. And I think that one of the tragic developments that has occurred in our society is that there's been this dislocation that has occurred where, as a society, we have the technological and economic capacity to look after everybody. In terms of available resources, if we wanted to, we could easily look after everybody. There wouldn't be any problems in this, which is why it is that you can have high levels of unemployment, in many parts of Southern Europe, and society is still taking over and carrying and moving on. But the problem is that whilst we can look after everybody, so for example, not everybody has to work, it just so happens that the people that don't work end up in circumstances that are highly damaging both for society and for themselves. I think one of the tragic consequences of a lot of young people not working or not even trying to work is that they spend a lot of time sort of watching daytime TV, or they spend a lot of time doing activities which doesn't really give meaning to them, and therefore they begin to have all kinds of problems, from mental health problems to a whole range of other deficits. And I think that that's the kind of world that we live in. And one of the challenges for us is to see how we can create a situation where everybody's creative powers can be harnessed some way. Now, we don't have to call that work, and we don't even have to call that employed work in the way that we kind of classically think about it. But there is no reason why, if we have a visionary government, why we cannot use our resources in such a way that we provide people with some outlets through which their capacity for creating, for making things, from networking with other people can be developed. You might want to call that a high-tech public work scheme, that you provide individuals. It doesn't have to be like in the old days where you told people to build roads and you gave them a little bit of money. It can be a much more innovative way of getting people in, particularly in those areas of the country where there's mass unemployment, to engage on a regular basis with each other. Because if that doesn't happen, then the very basic structure of their lives, from getting up in the morning to keeping time in the most elementary sense, all those things will be gone. And I think that's roughly the direction that we should be moving in, and how we kind of expand that. Because actually, at the end of the day, when it comes to work, it becomes, in our lives, a social responsibility. We as individuals have got to get a job, and it's our responsibility to look after ourselves. But society also has a responsibility to ensure that work is really available. In England now we have a situation where, because of the fact that a lot of people haven't worked for a very, very long time, even when there are jobs, they don't want to work. I mean, where I live in Kent, and we have a massive shortage of labor. For example, nobody wants, we have farms where there's fruits to be picked, where there's tractors to be driven, where there are roads to be built, and the people that have been unemployed for 4 generations are no longer capable of getting up in the morning and applying for work. So what happens is that the only people that will take those jobs are people coming in from East Europe, people coming in from abroad, and they, for them this becomes a real opportunity. And when you talk to the guys, the English guys who are not working, why aren't you going and at least getting a modicum of a job? Why aren't you using your your kind of power to make some money and work, they look at you blankly and they basically roll their eyes and they say, whatever, sort of, and that's the answer you get, whatever, and it's not really their fault as individuals. I think what has happened is that the system, the kind of reproduction of being so disconnected from society has taken such a heavy toll that you literally have people who have lost that imagination and the capacity for work, at least in terms of this generation. I like your first question, which is something that we should all be thinking about, which is how we use the new technology in a way that enhances sort of society. And I think it's worth remembering that the way this happens is almost accidental. I think it's interesting that one of the technologies that has been used very, very effectively in many, many parts of the world are mobile telephones, cell telephones, which have become a very useful currency in places like Africa. Nobody ever imagined that this thing that you got in your pocket, that this thing that you're kind of looking at, can become a source of investment, which kind of small holder farmers used as a way of getting loans from banks. So what you do is you have these informal banks in many parts of Africa, which lend you enough money to buy seeds to plant so you can work productively on your land. And the basis on which you do that is either blockchain technology or just simply the computing power that you rent out to somebody else. So I think there are ways in which, in a surprising way, people have taken technology and used it in a very creative kind of a way. But at the moment, what seems to happen is that, and this is generally the story with technology, is whenever you have new technology, it's very often used, first of all, for the purposes of luxury consumption, or as we're doing now, for playing, right? For playing. And we've got so much computing power and so much computing energy that is not being harnessed and not being used for constructive social ends. It's simply being used by kids to kind of mess around, or in many cases, it's being used by adults to kind of mess around.
Thank you. Frank, more questions? Altre domande?
So I totally agree when you say that we should not fear technology, because basically technology lacks a conscience. Even though watching some videos from robots, for example, from Boston Dynamics, makes you doubt even this. But there is a practical problem. If you think about many, many jobs in the future, they will be actually replaced by robots. Not the most intellectual ones, for example, not lawyers, not accountants, perhaps accountants, but for example, many robots in constructions or in power plants or in automotive industries. And objectively, these kind of workers will need to be relocated somewhere else, doing something else. And when just a part of population is working in the sense of getting an income from their work, it means that other workers will need to subsidize them for the lack of income that we will incur. So what do you think will be the future in this case for those kind of works of jobs that will be easily mass replaced by robots?
Well, I think you raise a very important problem. It's always the case that technology displaces some jobs. That's always happened from the beginning of technological development. But if you look at the historical pattern, what happens is that as technology displaces people and makes them unemployed, so new jobs are created. And the general pattern is that technology raises productivity, it raises wealth, and at the same time provides more resources for creating new sectors. And the wonderful thing about technological development, which is really human development, because that's what we're talking about, is that as we created a new sector of technology, so it opens up the possibility of finding new ways of working and giving new forms of employment to people. And I'm actually quite optimistic that although some people will suffer, because if you've been printing and working as a printer and now a robot does your job, there's no way you're ever going to become a printer again. Nevertheless, what will happen is that on balance, there's a good chance that other kinds of jobs will be available, and if it isn't, then society will have to step in and provide a bridge so that people can, make it to the next world, the new world that they're moving into. But one of the interesting things is I looked at some studies on this. For example, new farming technology has released a lot of people from working in the fields, doing a lot of difficult work. But at the same time as a lot of people have left the land and no longer work as peasants or as farmers, a lot of people are now involved in new kinds of food production, where they provide, they're kind of involved in organic food production. They've got very specialized things that they're doing. It's very, very interesting. If you go to New York or most big cities in America, you'll find that there's every Sunday or every Wednesday, there's a farmer's market. And when you look at and you talk to the people who are in the farmer's market, they're very often people that used to work in a sector of industry which has closed down. So they're kind of moving on and finding new jobs. And I think that there's no reason why that kind of dynamic couldn't really continue. And what my hope is, and this obviously is again a question of judgment, is that we use the technology wisely. So that what we're doing is we're bringing in new technology, but we're also at the same time providing an educational and a cultural milieu within which people can then move on and find jobs that are, if anything, better than the ones that were left behind, because it gives them more space for controlling their lives.
Grazie, avevo una domanda da quella parte.
Hello, going toward. Hello, I completely agree with the fact that work is a matter of identity, mostly. Just telling about where I come from, I'm a founder of a project that helps people to find job together. It's called Job Club. So I've helped thousands of people, probably directly or indirectly, to find jobs. And I can definitely see this. Well, people, it's not they don't want to work, they don't want to do a work they don't like, which is different. And it's a matter of inner motivation rather than external motivation, which was more of our fathers, and particularly for the youngsters, this is true. So I definitely agree with that. But jumping on the question of our fellow friend here, what I think we might do to try to help those people that are being cutting off from the job market, and possibly they will in the future because of impact of technology, of other things, is basically three things. I'll try to do it very quickly, and then I will ask you your opinion about it. First is to think of job or work in a more wider way. I don't think that it's true there are a lot of people that are not working there. They are working, but they're not paid for it, which is different. And secondly is maybe to focus more, and without the maybe, focus more on what the people want to do, instead to tell them what they have to do. A lot of people come to me or to other people asking what I have to do, what I have to study, and then they end up in a miserable career where they don't progress, they don't learn, and if their company closes, they get stuck and they get in unemployment. And third thing, maybe start to talk about technology in a little bit different way. Whenever we talk about technology or innovation, we think about tools, devices, electronics, computers, but innovation can be social, can be cultural. You made the example before. Probably you don't want to be cured by a robot in the future, and neither I would. So probably there are lots of work out there in the culture and care fields which are being diminished for dozens of years, that maybe now we can kind of bring up through a lot of people, through what they want to do, and maybe talking about technology and innovation, not just in terms of computers and other stuff, because this I find people are scared of, and they keep off from that, and then they don't want to find a job, really. So what you're thinking, kind of turning the way, the storytelling of technology in this way to help this new age of work, maybe. Thank you.
I'm not sure if I agree with most of what you said, but not the last point. I don't think people are that scared of robots and computers, and you can see the rapidity with which young people and now old people have embraced everything from cell phones to using Facebooks to Skype. I mean, it's just amazing, how, a lot of even old people have just made that part and parcel of their lives in a very, very short period of time. So the resistance, and I couldn't believe it because I talked to a friend of mine, a sociologist, and he looked into this whole phenomenon of having sex with robots. I mean, I still find that very alien. I don't think I'm going to be involved in very much of that, activity. But the very fact that some people can actually have the desire to kind of do this indicates that there is in principle no big kind of barriers to that. I agree with you that that work and what it means is actually not what it seems. So earlier on, we talked about there being a lot of jobless people in Africa. But I think what's very interesting is that if you look at the surface, under the surface in Africa, the jobless people are actually working. I mean, when I go to Africa and I talk to these, you go to a market and all these guys hanging around on scooters. And basically, sort of when you talk to them, you realize that they are working. They're always looking for something to do. It's maybe a half an hour there, an hour there, they help somebody out here, but they're always looking for something. And similarly, if you look at the black economy in Italy and Spain, I mean, it's not the case that all these millions of young people are just looking at their shoelaces. They're all doing something on the side. I mean, they're all, so it's not like they're completely without work. So there is that kind of phenomenon. I think what I worry about is an even bigger problem, not people who are not working enough, but the kind of problem that exists in England and America particularly, where you have, literally, entire communities of people who've never worked, who are on opioids and drugs, who actually are not capable of working or even looking after themselves, who are having children, and there is nothing in that system that can begin to provide something for them, for something to do. I think that's really where we do need to think about some of the difficulties that we're faced with. And I think your solution of essentially ensuring that we see technology in a much more broader way, that technology isn't just made up of physical stuff. I think that's where 3D technology is really quite interesting. It doesn't have to be just purely metals and all that kind of stuff, but understanding that technology is something that evolves through human networking and interaction means that if we have that kind of approach towards life, then we can begin to enrich the experience of work and create the kind of jobs that we don't have at the moment, but which can be potentially, extremely, creative. I mean, one of the things that I've been arguing for in England is that, we desperately could use to invest resources in what I call 24-hour-a-day nurseries, daycare for children. I think that's it's one of those things where I'm really surprised by society being so unimaginative. Just think what a big change 24-hour-a-day daycare could mean. I mean, first of all, it would give women in particular, but also all parents, a phenomenal amount of independence. We could create a world where looking after children was actually very highly valued, and we could treat that kind of childcare as not something that you just do on the side and is not taken seriously. And we can use those kinds of institutions as a way of kind of building trust and connections between people in a way that doesn't exist at the moment. I think to me, one of the best sides for seeing solidarity and human interaction is when you go into a nursery, right? Because you've got two things going on. You have the children playing with each other, but you have all the parents making friends with each other and making little connections and network. And I think there are many, many possibilities like that, where new kinds of jobs, new kinds of work can be created.
Un'ultima domanda.
Mi piacerebbe sapere un suo parere, magari in breve, rispetto a un appello che è circolato tempo fa, firmato da molti scienziati all'era mondiale, il capofila era Hawkins, se non sbaglio, in cui si chiedeva una moratoria per alcuni anni riguardo alla ricerca applicata dell'intelligenza artificiale. In particolare facevano riferimento ai pericoli insiti in questa ricerca per quanto nel campo militare, della difesa e anche della genetica. In sostanza non si chiedeva di smetterla, ma di fermarsi un attimo a riflettere per i rischi che queste cose potessero sfuggire di mano. Questo in sostanza. Grazie.
Yeah, I mean, I read that appeal. I think that Hawkins has got a fundamentally conservative view of experimentation in this particular area. And I don't think that stopping research is the way forward. I think it always comes back to the question of judgment, of making judgments about how we use research, the areas that we apply our research institutions towards. And it seems to me that he seems to have, it's almost like he's looking for a problem to solve, when at the moment it's far from evident that there is a problem. One of the things that I worry about in Europe is that we become extremely precautionary when it comes to scientific innovation and research. We're continually looking for the downsides of research. We're always worried about its possible side effects. And it comes to a situation where if we continue with this very conservative, risk-averse ethos, then I think that innovation in a number of areas is going to be limited. One of the areas that this is particularly been hit by has been in the pharmaceutical sector, where if you look at the slowness of medical innovation in Europe compared to its potential, I find that extremely worrisome. There's a continuous reluctance on the part of the pharmaceutical industry to innovate because they know that there's a very good chance that their new products will be regulated out of existence. And I think that instead of just having this, don't do it, we must stop kind of attitude, we can have a much more intelligent attitude of weighing things up. Is it going to have negative consequences? What's the balance of negative and positive? We've got to weigh up the risks, and I think that genetic technology, to me, is a very exciting area for further development, and I'm totally for continuing along those lines, as long as we use our intelligence, and as long as we sort of take ourselves seriously as scientists, and as long as policymakers and politicians play the role of ensuring that decisions that are taken are well informed.
Bene, ci fermiamo qui, grazie al professor Furedi, grazie a tutti voi, alle 2:30 c'è un altro evento. Grazie, arrivederci.